hence meaningless to ask whether an act can be foreseen when all its antecedents are given. Hence it is a question devoid of meaning to ask, could or could not the act be foreseen, given the sum total of its antecedents? For there are two ways of assimilating these antecedents, the one dynamic, the other static. In the first case, we shall be led by imperceptible steps to identify ourselves with the person we are dealing with, to pass through the same series of states, and thus to get back to the very moment at which the act is performed. Hence, there can no longer be any question of foreseeing it. In the second case, we presuppose the final act by the mere fact of annexing to the qualitative description of the previous states the quantitative appreciation of their importance. Here again, the one party is led merely to realize that the act is not yet performed when it is to be performed, and the other that when performed, it is performed. This, like the previous discussion, leaves the question of freedom exactly where it was to begin with. The two fallacies involved: 1. Regarding intensity as a magnitude, not a quality. 2. Substituting material symbol for dynamic process. By going deeper into this twofold argument, we shall find, at its very root, the two fundamental illusions of the reflective consciousness. The first consists in regarding intensity as a mathematical property of psychic states, and not, as we said at the beginning of this essay, as a special quality, as a particular shade of these various states. The second consists in substituting for the concrete reality or dynamic progress which consciousness perceives the material symbol of its progress when it has already reached its end, that is to say, of the act already accomplished together with the series of its antecedents. Certainly, once the final act is completed, I can ascribe to all the antecedents their proper value, and picture the interplay of these various elements as a conflict or a composition of forces. But to ask whether the antecedents being known as well as their value, one could foretell the final act, is to beg the question. It is to forget that we cannot know the value of the antecedents without knowing the final act, which is the very thing that is not yet known. It is to suppose wrongly that the symbolical diagram which we draw in our own way for representing the action when completed has been drawn by the action itself whilst progressing, and drawn by it in an automatic manner. Claiming to foresee an action always comes back to confusing time with space. Now, in these two illusions themselves, a third one is involved, and you will see that the question whether the act could or could not be foreseen always comes back to this. Is time space? You begin by setting side by side, in some ideal space, the conscious states which succeed one another in Peter's mind, and you perceive his life as a kind of path MOXY traced out by a moving body M in space. You then blot out, in thought, the part OXY of this curve, and you inquire whether, knowing MO, you would have been able to determine the portion OX of the curve which the moving body describes beyond O. Such is, in the main, the question which you put when you bring in a philosopher, Paul, who lives before Peter and has to picture to himself the conditions under which Peter will act. You thus materialize these conditions. You make the time to come into a road already marked out across the plain, which we can contemplate from the top of a mountain, even if we have not traversed it and are never to do so. But now you soon notice that the knowledge of the part MO of the curve would not be enough unless you were shown the position of the points of this line, not only in relation to one another, but also in relation to the points of the whole line MOXY, which would amount to being given in advance the very elements which have to be determined. So you then alter your hypothesis. You realize that time does not require to be seen, but to be lived, and hence you conclude that if your knowledge of the line MO was not a sufficient datum. The reason must have been that you looked at it from the outside instead of identifying yourself with the point M, which describes not only MO but also the whole curve, and thus making its movement your own. Therefore you persuade Paul to come and coincide with Peter, and naturally then it is the line MOXY which Paul traces out in space, since by hypothesis Peter describes this line. But in no wise do you prove thus that Paul foresaw Peter's action. You only show that Peter acted in the way he did, since Paul became Peter. It is true that you then come back, unwittingly, to your former hypothesis, because you continually confuse the line MOXY in its tracing with the line MOXY already traced. That is to say, time and space. After causing Paul to come down and identify himself with Peter as long as was required, you let him go up again and resume his former post of observation. No wonder if he then perceives the line MOXY complete. He himself has just been completing it. Confusion arising from prediction of astronomical phenomena. What makes the confusion a natural and almost an unavoidable one is that science seems to point to many cases where we do anticipate the future. Do we not determine beforehand the conjunctions of heavenly bodies, solar and lunar eclipses, in short, the greater number of astronomical phenomena? Does not then the human intellect embrace in the present moment immense intervals of duration still to come? No doubt it does. But an anticipation of this kind has not the slightest resemblance to the anticipation of a voluntary act. Indeed, as we shall see, the reasons which render it possible to foretell an astronomical phenomenon are the ones which prevent us from determining in advance an act which springs from our free activity. For the future of the material universe, although contemporaneous with the future of a conscious being, has no analogy to it. Illustration from hypothetical acceleration of physical movements. In order to put our finger on this vital difference, let us assume for a moment that some mischievous illustration genius, more powerful still than the mischievous genius conjured up by Descartes, decreed that all the movements of the universe should go twice as fast. There would be no change in astronomical phenomena, or at any rate in the equations which enable us to foresee them, for in these equations the symbol t does not stand for a duration, but for a relation between two durations, for a certain number of units of time, in short, for a certain number of simultaneities. These simultaneities, these coincidences, would still take place in equal number, only the intervals which separate them would have diminished. But these intervals never make their appearance in our calculations. Now, these intervals are just duration lived, duration which our consciousness perceives, and our consciousness would soon inform us of a shortening of the day if we had not experienced the usual amount of duration between sunrise and sunset. No doubt it would not measure this shortening, and perhaps it would not even perceive it immediately, as a change of quantity, but it would realize in some way or other a decline in the usual storing up of experience, a change in the progress usually accomplished between sunrise and sunset. Astronomical prophecy such as acceleration. Now, when an astronomer foretells, e.g., a lunar eclipse, he merely exercises in his own way the power which we have ascribed to our mischievous genius. He decrees that time shall go 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times as fast, and he has a right to do so, since all that he thus changes is the nature of the conscious intervals, and since these intervals, by hypothesis, do not enter into the calculations. Therefore, into a psychological duration of a few seconds, he may put several years, even several centuries of astronomical time. That is his procedure when he traces in advance the path of a heavenly body, or represents it by an equation. What he does is nothing but establishing a series of relations of position between this body and other bodies, between this body and other given bodies, a series of simultaneities and coincidences, a series of numerical relations. As for the duration properly so called, it remains outside the calculation and could only be perceived by a consciousness capable of living through the intervals and, in fact, living the intervals themselves, instead of merely perceiving their extremities. Indeed, it is even conceivable that this consciousness could live so slow and lazy a life as to take in the whole path of the heavenly body in a single perception, just as we do when we perceive the successive positions of a shooting star as one line of fire. Such a consciousness would find itself really in the same conditions in which the astronomer places himself ideally. It would see in the present what the astronomer perceives in the future. In truth, if the latter foresees a future phenomenon, it is only on condition of making it to a certain extent a present phenomenon, or at least of enormously reducing the interval which separates us from it. In short, the time of which we speak in astronomy is a number, and the nature of the units of this number cannot be specified in our calculations. We may therefore assume them to be as small as we please, provided that the same hypothesis is extended to the whole series of operations, and that the successive relations of position in space are thus preserved. We shall then be presented in imagination at the phenomenon we wish to foretell. We shall know exactly at what point in space and after how many units of time this phenomenon takes place. If we then restore to these units their physical nature, we shall thrust the event again into the future and say that we have foreseen it, when in reality we have seen it. In dealing with states of consciousness, we cannot vary their duration without altering their nature. But these units of time which make up living duration, and which the astronomer can dispose of as he pleases, because they give no handle to science, are just what concern the psychologist, for psychology deals with the intervals themselves and not with their extremities. Certainly, pure consciousness does not perceive time as a sum of units of duration. Left to itself, it has no means and even no reason to measure time, but a feeling which lasted only half the number of days, for example, would no longer be the same feeling for it. It would lack thousands of impressions which gradually thickened its substance and altered its color. True, when we give this feeling a certain name, when we treat it as a thing, we believe that we can diminish its duration by half, for example, and also have the duration of all the rest, and also halve the duration of all the rest of our history. It seems that it would still be the same life, only on a reduced scale. But we forget that states of consciousness are processes, and not things. That if we denote them each by a single word, it is for the convenience of language, that they are alive, and therefore constantly changing. That, in consequence, it is impossible to cut off a moment from them without making them poorer by the loss of some impression, and thus altering their quality. I quite understand that the orbit of a planet might be perceived all at once or in a very short time, because its successive positions or the results of its movement are the only things that matter, and not the duration of the equal intervals which separate them. But when we have to do with a feeling, it has no precise result except its having been felt. And to estimate this result adequately, it would be necessary to have gone through all the phases of the feeling itself and to have taken up the same duration. Even if this feeling has finally issued in some definite action, which might be compared to the definite position of a planet in space, the knowledge of this act will hardly enable us to estimate the influence of the feeling on the whole of a life story, and it is this very influence which we want to know. All foreseeing is in reality seeing, and this seeing takes place when we can reduce as much as we please an interval of future time while preserving the relation of its parts to one another, as happens in the case of astronomical predictions. But what does reducing an interval of time mean, except emptying or impoverishing the conscious states which fill it? And does not the very possibility of seeing an astronomical period in miniature thus imply the impossibility of modifying a psychological series in the same way, since it is only by taking this psychological series as an invariable basis that we shall be able to make an astronomical period vary arbitrarily as regards the unit of duration? Difference between past and future duration in this respect. Thus, when we ask whether a future action could have been foreseen, we unwittingly identify that time with which we have to do in the exact sciences, and which is reducible to a number with real duration, whose so-called quantity is really a quality, and which we cannot curtail by an instant without altering the nature of the facts which fill it. No doubt, the identification is made easier by the fact that in a large number of cases we are justified in dealing with real duration as with astronomical time. Thus, when we call to mind the past, a series of deeds done, we always shorten it, without however distorting the nature of the event which interests us. The reason is that we know it already, for the psychic state, when it reaches the end of the progress which constitutes its very existence, becomes a thing which one can picture to oneself all at once. Here we find ourselves in the same position as the astronomer, when he takes in at a glance the orbit which a planet will need several years to traverse. In fact, astronomical prediction should be compared with the recollection of the past state of consciousness, not with the anticipation of the future one. But when we have to determine a future state of consciousness, however superficial it may be, we can no longer view the antecedents in a static condition as things. We must view them in a dynamic condition as processes, since we are concerned with their influence alone. Now, their duration is this very influence. Therefore, it will no longer do to shorten future duration in order to picture its parts beforehand. One is bound to live its duration whilst it is unfolding. As far as deep-seated psychic states are concerned, there is no perceptible difference between foreseeing, seeing, and acting. The determinist argument that psychic phenomena are subject to the law same antecedents, same consequent. Only one course will remain open to the determinist. He will probably give up asserting the possibility of foreseeing a certain future act or state of consciousness, but will maintain that every act is determined by its psychic antecedents, or in other words, that the facts of consciousness, when the phenomena of nature are subject to laws. The phenomena of nature are subject to laws. This way of arguing means, at bottom, that he will leave out the particular features of the concrete psychic states, lest he find himself confronted by phenomena which defy all symbolical representation, and therefore all anticipation. The particular nature of these phenomena is thus thrust out of sight, but it is asserted that, being phenomena, they must remain subject to the law of causality. Now, it is argued, this law means that every phenomenon is determined by its conditions, or, in other words, that the same causes produce the same effects. Either, then, the act is inseparably bound to its antecedents, or the principle of causality admits of an incomprehensible exception. But as regards inner states, the same antecedents will never recur. This last form of the determinist argument differs less than might be thought from all the others which have been examined above. To say that the same inner causes will reproduce the same effects is to assume that the same cause can appear a second time on the stage of consciousness. Now, if duration is what we say, deep-seated psychic states are radically heterogeneous to each other, and it is impossible that any two of them should be quite alike, since they are two different moments of a life story. While the external object does not bear the mark of the time that has elapsed, and thus, in spite of the difference of time, the physicist can again encounter identical elementary conditions. Duration is something real for the consciousness which preserves the trace of it, and we cannot here speak of identical conditions, because the same moment does not occur twice. It is no use arguing that, even if there are no two deep-seated psychic states which are altogether alike, yet analysis would resolve these different states into more general and homogeneous elements which might be compared with each other. This would be to forget that even the simplest psychic elements possess a personality and a life of their own, however superficial they may be. They are in a constant state of becoming, and the same feeling, by the mere fact of being repeated, is a new feeling. Indeed, we have no reason for calling it by its former name, save that it corresponds to the same external cause or projects itself outwardly into similar attitudes. Hence, it would simply be begging the question to deduce from the so-called likeness of two conscious states that the same cause produces the same effect. In short, if the causal relation still holds good in the realm of inner states, it cannot resemble in any way what we call causality in nature. For the physicist, the same cause always produces the same effect. For a psychologist who does not let himself be misled by merely apparent analogies, a deep-seated inner cause produces its effect once for all and will never reproduce it. And if it is now asserted that this effect was inseparably bound up with this particular cause, such an assertion will mean one of two things: either that, the antecedents being given, the future action might have been foreseen, or that, the action having once been performed, any other action else seen under the given conditions to have been impossible. Now we saw that both these assertions were equally meaningless, and that they also involved a false conception of duration. Analysis of the conception of cause, which underlies the whole determinist argument. Analysis of the conception of cause, which underlies the whole determinist argument. Nevertheless, it will be worthwhile to dwell on this latter form of the determinist argument, even though it be only to explain, from our point of view, the meaning of the two words determination and causality. In vain do we argue that there cannot be any question either of foreseeing a future action in the way that an astronomical phenomenon is foreseen, or of asserting, when once an action is done, that any other action would have been impossible under the given conditions. In vain do we add that even when it takes the form, the same causes produce the same effects. The principle of universal determination loses every shred of meaning in the inner world of conscious states. The determinist will perhaps yield to our arguments on each of these 3 points in particular, will admit that in the physical field one cannot ascribe any of these 3 meanings to the word determination, will probably fail to discover a 4th meaning, and yet will go on repeating that the act is inseparably bound up with its antecedents. We thus find ourselves here confronted by so deep-seated a misapprehension and so obstinate a prejudice that we cannot get the better of them without attacking them at their root, which is the principle of causality. By analyzing the concept of cause, we shall show the ambiguity which it involves, and, though not aiming at a formal definition of freedom, we shall perhaps get beyond the purely negative idea of it which we have framed up to the present. Causality as regular succession does not apply to conscious states and cannot disprove free will. We perceive physical phenomena, and these phenomena obey laws. This means 1. That phenomena A, B, C, D, previously perceived, can occur again in the same shape. 2. That a certain phenomenon P, which appeared after the conditions A, B, C, D, and after these conditions only, will not fail to recur as soon as the same conditions are again present. If the principle of causality told us nothing more, as the empiricists claim, we should willingly grant these philosophers that their principle is derived from experience, but it would no longer prove anything against our freedom, for it would then be understood that definite antecedents give rise to a definite consequent wherever experience shows us this regular succession. But the question is whether this regularity is found in the domain of consciousness too, and that is the whole problem of free will. We grant you for a moment that the principle of causality is nothing but the summing up of the uniform and unconditional successions observed in the past. By what right, then, do you apply it to those deep-seated states of consciousness in which no regular succession has yet been discovered, since the attempt to foresee them ever fails? And how can you base on this principle your argument to prove the determinism of inner states, when, according to you, the determinism of observed facts is the sole source of the principle itself? In truth, when the empiricists make use of the principle of causality to disprove human freedom, they take the word cause in a new meaning, which is the very meaning given to it by common sense. To assert the regular succession of two phenomena is, indeed, to recognize that, the first being given, we already catch sight of the second. But this wholly subjective connection between two ideas is not enough for common sense. It seems to common sense that if the idea of the second phenomenon is already implied in that of the first, the second phenomenon itself must exist objectively, in some way or other, within the first phenomenon. And common sense was bound to come to this conclusion, because to distinguish exactly between an objective connection of phenomena and a subjective association between their ideas presupposes a fairly high degree of philosophical culture. We thus pass imperceptibly from the first meaning to the second, and we picture the causal relation as a kind of prefiguring of the future phenomenon in its present conditions. Now, this prefiguring can be understood in two very different ways, and it is just here that the ambiguity begins. Causality as the prefiguring of the future phenomenon in its present conditions, in one form destroys concrete phenomena. In the first place, mathematics furnishes us with one type of this kind of prefiguring, the very movement by which we draw the circumference of a circle on a sheet of paper generates all the mathematical properties of this figure. In this sense, an unlimited number of theorems can be said to pre-exist within the definition, although they will be spread out in duration for the mathematician who deduces them. It is true that we are here in the realm of pure quantity, and that, as geometrical properties can be expressed in the form of equations, it is easy to understand how the original equation, expressing the fundamental property of the figure, is transformed into an unlimited number of new ones, all virtually contained in the first. On the contrary, physical phenomena, which succeed one another and are perceived by our senses, are distinguished by quality no less than by quantity, so that there would be some difficulty in at once declaring them equivalent to one another. But Just because they are perceived through our sense organs, we seem justified in ascribing their qualitative difference to the impression which they make on us, and assuming behind the heterogeneity of our sensations a homogeneous physical universe. Thus, we shall strip matter of the concrete qualities with which our senses clothe it: color, heat, resistance, even weight, and we shall finally find ourselves confronted with homogeneous extensity, space without body. The only step then remaining will be to describe figures in space, to make them move according to mathematically formulated laws, and to explain the apparent qualities of matter by the shape, position, and motion of these geometrical figures. Now, position is given by a system of fixed magnitudes, and motion is expressed by a law, i.e., by a constant relation between variable magnitudes. But shape is a mental image, and however tenuous, however transparent we assume it to be, it still constitutes, insofar as our imagination has, so to speak, the visual perception of it, a concrete and therefore irreducible quality of matter. It will therefore be necessary to make a clean sweep of this image itself and replace it by the abstract formula of the movement which gives rise to the figure. Picture then the algebraical relations getting entangled in one another, becoming objective by this very entanglement, and producing by the mere effect of their complexity concrete, visible, and tangible reality. You will be merely drawing the consequences of the principle of causality, understood in the sense of an actual prefiguring of the future in the present. The scientists of our time do not seem, indeed, to have carried abstraction so far, except perhaps Lord Kelvin. This acute and profound physicist assumed that space is filled with a homogeneous and incomprehensible fluid in which vortices move, thus producing the properties of matter. These vortices are the constituent elements of bodies. The atom thus becomes a movement, and physical phenomena are reduced to regular movements, taking place within an incompressible fluid. But if you will notice that this fluid is perfectly homogeneous, that between its parts there is neither an empty interval which separates them, nor any difference whatever by which they can be distinguished, you will see that all movement taking place within this fluid is really equivalent to absolute immobility, since before, during, and after the movement nothing changes and nothing has changed in the whole. The movement which is here spoken of is thus not a movement which actually takes place, but only a movement which is pictured mentally. It is a relation between relations. It is simplicity. It is implicitly supposed, though perhaps not actually realized, that motion has something to do with consciousness, that in space there are only simultaneities, and that the business of the physicist is to provide us with the means of calculating these relations of simultaneity for any moment of our duration. Nowhere has mechanism been carried further than in this system, since the very shape of the ultimate events of matter is here reduced to a movement. But the Cartesian physics already anticipated this interpretation, for if matter is nothing, as Descartes claimed, but homogeneous extensity, the movements of the parts of this extensity can be conceived through the abstract law which governs them, or through an algebraical equation between variable magnitudes, but cannot be represented under the concrete form of an image. And it would not be difficult to prove that the more the progress of mechanical explanations enables us to develop this conception of causality, and therefore to relieve the atom of the weight of its sensible qualities, the more the concrete existence of the phenomena of nature tends to vanish into algebraical smoke. It thus leads to Descartes' physics and Spinoza's metaphysics, but cannot bind future to present without neglecting duration. Thus understood, the relation of causality is a necessary relation, in the sense that it will indefinitely approach the relation of identity, as a curve approaches its asymptote. The principle of identity is the absolute law of our consciousness. It asserts that what is thought at the moment when we think it. And what gives this principle its absolute necessity is that it does not bind the future to the present, but only the present to the present. It expresses the unshakable confidence that consciousness feels in itself, so long as, faithful to its duty, it confines itself to declaring the apparent present state of the mind. But the principle of causality, insofar as it is supposed to bind the future to the present, could never take the form of a necessary principle. For the successive moments of real time are not bound up with one another, and no effort of logic will succeed in proving that what has been will be or will continue to be, that the same antecedents will always give rise to identical consequence. Descartes understood this so well that he attributed the regularity of the physical world and a continuation of the same effects to the constantly renewed grace of Providence. He built up, as it were, an instantaneous physics intended for a universe the whole duration of which might as well be confined to the present moment. And Spinoza maintained that the indefinite series of phenomena, which takes for us the form of a succession in time, was equivalent in the absolute to the divine unity. He thus assumed, on the one hand, that the relation of apparent causality between phenomena melted away into a relation of identity in the absolute, and on the other, that the indefinite duration of things was all contained in a single moment, which is eternity. In short, whether we study Cartesian physics, Spinozistic metaphysics, or the scientific theories of our own time, we shall find everywhere the same anxiety to establish a relation of logical necessity between cause and effect, and we shall see that this anxiety shows itself in a tendency to transform relations of succession into relations of inherence, to do away with active duration, and to substitute for apparent causality a fundamental identity. The necessary determination of phenomena implies non-duration, but we endure and are therefore free. Now, if the development of the notion of causality, understood in the sense of necessary connection, leads to the Spinozistic or Cartesian conception of nature, inversely, all relation of necessary determination established between successive phenomena may be supposed to arise from our perceiving, in a confused form, some mathematical mechanism behind their heterogeneity. We do not claim that common sense has any intuition of kinetic theories of matter, still less perhaps of a Spinozistic mechanism. But it will be seen that the more the effect seems necessarily bound up with the cause, the more we tend to put it in the cause itself, as a mathematical consequence in its principle, and thus to cancel the effect of duration. That under the influence of the same external conditions, I do not behave today as I behaved yesterday, is not at all surprising, because I change, because I endure. But things considered apart from our perception do not seem to endure, and the more thoroughly we examine this idea, the more absurd it seems to us to suppose that the same cause should not produce today the effect which it produced yesterday. We certainly feel, it is true, that although things do not endure as we do ourselves, nevertheless there must be some reason why phenomena are seen to succeed one another instead of being set out all at once. And this is why the notion of causality, although it gets indefinitely near that of identity, will never seem to us to coincide with it, unless we conceive clearly the idea of a mathematical mechanism, or unless some subtle metaphysics removes our very legitimate scruples on the point. It is no less obvious that our belief in the necessary determination of phenomena by one another becomes stronger in proportion as we are more inclined to regard duration as a subjective form of our consciousness. In other words, the more we tend to set up the causal relation as a relation of necessary determination, the more we assert thereby that things do not endure like ourselves. This amounts to saying that the more we strengthen the principle of causality, the more we emphasize the difference between a physical series and a psychical one. Whence, finally, it would result, however paradoxical the opinion may seem, that the assumption of a relation of mathematical inherence between external phenomena ought to bring with it, as a natural or at least as a plausible consequence, the belief in human free will. But this last consequence will not concern us for the moment. We are merely trying here to trace out the first meaning of the word causality, and we think we have shown that prefiguring of the future in the present is easily conceived under a mathematical form, thanks to a certain conception of duration which, without seeming to be so, is fairly familiar to common sense. Prefiguring, as having an idea of a future act which we cannot realize without effort, does not involve necessary determination. But there is a prefiguring of another kind, still more familiar to our mind, because immediate prefiguring, as consciousness gives us the type of it, we go, in fact, through successive states of consciousness, and although the later was not contained in the earlier, we had before us at the time a more or less confused idea of it. The actual realization of this idea, however, did not appear as certain, but merely as possible. Yet, between the idea and the action, some hardly perceptible intermediate processes come in, and the whole mass of which takes for us a form sui generis, which is called the feeling of effort, and from the idea of the effort, from the effort to the act, the progress has been so continuous that we cannot say where the idea and the effort end, and where the act begins. Hence we see that in a certain sense we may still say here that the future was prefigured in the present, but it must be added that this prefiguring is very imperfect, since the future action of which we have the present idea is conceived as realizable but not as realized, and since, even when we plan the effort necessary to accomplish it, we feel that there is still time to stop. If, then, we decide to picture the causal relation in this second form, we can assert a priori that there will no longer be a relation of necessary determination between the cause and the effect, for the effect will no longer be given in the cause. It will be there only in the state of pure possibility and as a vague idea which perhaps will not be followed by the corresponding action. But we shall not be surprised that this approximation is enough for common sense, if we think of the readiness with which children and primitive people accept the idea of a whimsical nature, in which caprice plays a part no less important than necessity. Nay, this way of conceiving causality will be more easily understood by the general run of people, since it does not demand any effort of abstraction, and only implies a certain analogy between the outer and the inner world, between the succession of objective phenomena and that of our subjective states. The second conception of causality leads to Leibniz as the first led to Spinoza. In truth, this second way of conceiving the relation of cause to effect is more natural than the first, in that it immediately satisfies the need of a mental image. If we look for the phenomenon B within the phenomenon A, which regularly precedes it, the reason is that the habit of associating the two images ends in giving us the idea of the second phenomenon wrapped up, as it were, in that of the first. It is natural, then, that we should push this objectification to its furthest limit, and that we should make the phenomenon A itself into a psychic state, in which the phenomenon B is supposed to be contained as a very vague idea. We simply suppose, thereby, that the objective connection of the two phenomena resembles the subjective association which suggested the idea of it to us. The qualities of things are thus set up as actual states, somewhat analogous to those of our own self. The material universe is credited with a vague personality, which is diffused through space, and which, although not exactly endowed with a conscious will, is led on from one state to another by an inner impulse, a kind of effort. Such was ancient Hillozoism, a half-hearted and even contradictory hypothesis, which left matter its extensity although attributing to it real conscious states, and which spread the qualities of matter throughout extensity, while treating these qualities as inner, i.e., simple states. It was reserved for Leibniz to do away with this contradiction, and to show that, if the succession of external qualities of phenomena is understood as the succession of our own ideas, these qualities must be regarded as simple states or perceptions, and the matter which supports them as an unextended monad, analogous to our soul. But if such be the case, the successive states of matter cannot be perceived from the outside any more than our own psychic states. The hypothesis of pre-established harmony must be introduced in order to explain how these inner states are representative of one another. Thus, with our second conception of the relation of causality, we reach Leibniz. As with the first, we reached Spinoza. And in both cases, we merely push to their extreme limit or formulate with greater precision two half-hearted and confused ideas of common sense. It does not involve necessary determination. Now, it is obvious that the relation of causality, understood in this second way, does not involve the necessary determination of the effect by the cause. History indeed proves it. We see ancient Hillozoism, the first outcome of this conception of causality, explained the regular succession of causes and effects by a real deus ex machina. Sometimes it was a necessity external to things and hovering over them, sometimes an inner reason acting by rules somewhat similar to those which govern our own conduct. Nor do the perceptions of Leibniz's monad necessitate one another. God has to regulate their order in advance. In fact, Leibniz's determinism does not spring from his conception of the monad, but from the fact that he builds up the universe with monads only. Having denied all mechanical influence of substances on one another, he had to explain how it happens that their states correspond. Hence a determinism which arises from the necessity of positing a pre-established harmony, and not at all from the dynamic conception of the relation of causality. But let us leave history aside. Consciousness itself testifies that the abstract idea of force is that of indeterminate effort, that of an effort which has not yet issued in an act, and in which the act is still only at the stage of an idea. In other words, the dynamic conception of the causal relation ascribes to things a duration absolutely like our own, whatever may be the nature of this duration. To picture in this way the relation of cause to effect is to assume that the future is not more closely bound up with the present in the external world than it is in our own inner life. Each of these contradictory interpretations of causality and duration by itself safeguards freedom. Taken together, they destroy it. It follows from this twofold analysis that the principle of causality involves two contradictory conceptions of duration, two mutually exclusive ways of prefiguring the future in the present. Sometimes all phenomena, physical or psychical, are pictured as enduring in the same way, and therefore in the way that we do. In this case, the future will exist in the present only as an idea, and the passing from the present to the future will take the form of an effort which does not always lead to the realization of the idea conceived. Sometimes, on the other hand, duration is regarded as the characteristic form of conscious states. In this case, things are no longer supposed to endure as we do, and a mathematical pre-existence of their future in their present is admitted. Now, each of these two hypotheses, when taken by itself, safeguards human freedom. For the first would lead to the result that even the phenomena of nature were contingent, and the second, by attributing the necessary determination of physical phenomena to the fact that things do not endure as we do, invites us to regard the self which is subject to duration as a free force. Therefore, every clear conception of causality, where we know our own meaning, leads to the idea of human freedom as a natural consequence. Unfortunately, the habit has grown up of taking the principle of causality in both senses at the same time, because the one is more flattering to our imagination and the other is more favorable to mathematical reasoning. Sometimes we think particularly of the regular succession of physical phenomena and of the kind of inner effort by which one becomes another. Sometimes we fix our mind on the absolute regularity of these phenomena, and from the idea of regularity we pass by imperceptible steps to that of mathematical necessity, which excludes duration understood in the first way. And we do not see any harm in letting these two conceptions blend into one another and in assigning them greater importance to the one or the other according as we are more or less concerned with the interests of science. But to apply the principle of causality in this ambiguous form to the succession of conscious states is uselessly and wantonly to run into inextricable difficulties. The idea of force, which really excludes that of necessary determination, has got into the habit, so to speak, of amalgamating with that of necessity, in consequence of the very use which we make of the principle of causality in nature. On the one hand, we know force only through the witness of consciousness, and consciousness does not assert, does not even understand, the absolute determination, now of actions that are still to come. That is all that experience teaches us. And if we hold by experience, we should say that we feel ourselves free, that we perceive force, rightly or wrongly, as a free spontaneity. But, on the other hand, this idea of force carried over into nature, traveling there side by side with the idea of necessity, has got corrupted before it returns from the journey. It returns impregnated with the idea of necessity, and in the light of the role which we have made it play in the external world, we regard force as determining with strict necessity the effects which flow from it. Here again the mistake made by consciousness arises from the fact that it looks at the self, not directly, but by a kind of refraction through the forms which it has lent to external perception, and which the latter does not give back without having left its mark on them. A compromise, as it were, has been brought about between the idea of force and that of necessary determination. The whole mechanical determination of two external phenomena by one another now assumes in our eyes the same form as the dynamic relation of our exertion of force to the act which springs from it. But in return, this latter relation takes the form of a mathematical derivation, the human action being supposed to issue mechanically and therefore necessarily from the force which produces it. There is no doubt that this mingling of two different and almost opposite ideas offers advantages to common sense, since it enables us to picture in the same way and denote by one and the same word both the relation which exists between two moments of our life and that which binds together the successive moments of the external world. We have seen that Though our deepest conscious states exclude numerical multiplicity, yet we break them up into parts external to one another, that though the elements of concrete duration permeate one another, duration expressing itself in extensity exhibits moments as distinct as the bodies scattered in space. It is surprising then that between the moment of our life when it has been, so to speak, objectified, we set up a relation analogous to the objective relation of causality, and that an exchange, which again may be compared to the phenomenon of endosmosis, takes place between the dynamic idea of free effort and the mathematical conception of necessary determination. Though united in popular thought, the ideas of free effort and necessary determination are kept apart by physical science. But the sundering of these two ideas is an accomplished fact in the natural sciences. The physicist may speak of forces, and even picture their mode of action by analogy with an inner effort, but he will never introduce this hypothesis into a scientific explanation. Even those who, with Faraday, replace the extended atoms by dynamic points will treat the centers of force and lines will treat the centers of force and the lines of force mathematically without troubling about force itself, considered as an activity or an effort. It thus comes to be understood that the relation of external causality is purely mathematical and has no resemblance to the relation between psychical force and the act which springs from it. They should be kept apart too by psychology. It is now time to add that the relation of inner causality is purely dynamic and has no analogy with the relation of two external phenomena which condition one another. For as the latter are capable of recurring in a homogeneous space, the relation can be expressed in terms of a law, whereas deep-seated psychic states occur once in consciousness and will never occur again. A careful analysis of the psychological phenomenon led us to this conclusion in the beginning. The study of the notions of causality and duration, viewed in themselves, has merely confirmed it. Freedom real, but undefinable. We can now formulate our conception of freedom. Freedom is the relation of the concrete self to the act which it performs. The relation is indefinable just because we are free, for we can analyze a thing but not a process. We can speak of extensity but not duration. Or if we persist in analyzing it, we unconsciously transform the process into a thing and duration into extensity. By the very fact of breaking up concrete time, we set out its moments in homogeneous space. In place of the doing, we put the already done, and as we have begun by, so to speak, stereotyping the activity of the self, we see spontaneity settle down into inertia and freedom into necessity. Thus, any positive definition of freedom will ensure the victory of determinism. Shall we define the free act by saying of this act, when it is once done, that it might have been left undone? But this assertion, as also its opposite, implies the idea of an absolute equivalence between concrete duration and its spatial symbol. And as soon as we admit this equivalence, we are led on by the very development of the formula which we have just set forth to the most rigid determinism. Shall we define the free act as that which could not be foreseen even when all the conditions were known in advance? But to conceive all the conditions as given is, when dealing with concrete duration, to place oneself at the very moment at which the act is being performed, or else it is admitted that the matter of psychic duration can be pictured symbolically in advance, which amounts, as we said, to treating time as a homogeneous medium, and to reasserting in new words the absolute equivalence of duration with its symbol. A closer look of this second definition of freedom will thus bring us once more to determinism. Shall we finally define the free act by saying that it is not necessarily determined by its cause, but either these words lose their meaning or we understand by them that the same inner causes will not always call forth the same effects? We admit then that the psychic antecedents of a free act can be repeated, that freedom is displayed in a duration whose moments resemble one another, and that time is a homogeneous medium like space. We shall thus be brought back to the idea of an equivalence between duration and its spatial symbol, and by pressing the definition of freedom which we have laid down, we shall once more get determinism out of it. To sum up, every demand for explanation in regard to freedom comes back, without our suspecting it, to the following question: can time be adequately represented by space? To which we answer, yes, if you are dealing with time flown; no, if you speak of time flowing. Now, the free act takes place in time which is flowing, and not in time which has already flown. Freedom is therefore a fact, and among the facts which we observe there is none clearer. All the difficulties of the problem, and the problem itself, arise from the desire to endow duration with the same attributes as extensity, to interpret a succession by a simultaneity, and to express the idea of freedom in a language into which it is obviously untranslatable.